Welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here with us this week. Hope you had a wonderful Christmas holiday with your family and that you're getting ready for a great new year. We're just a couple days away now. Tonight, we start a very special series we're going to start looking at in several parts, and tonight is part one. And we're going to be looking at events in history that are commonly understood or commonly known in popular culture, what we were taught in school, things that you're taught by just talking to people on the street or just by anybody in your life that may have told you something about history. These are common events that we all understood or assumed to be true. And what we find when we really do the research and really dig into them in terms of historical fact is that most of them either did not happen or did not happen in the way that we commonly understood. And so it's going to be a really fun way to look at this with you guys and go down this little journey together on Traveling Through History to look at these really commonly known events that did not actually occur the way that we were taught they were. And so tonight we'll be doing part one. We'll be looking at 25 different events. Hopefully you learn a lot about these different events of what really did occur and what did not. And definitely drop us a comment after the episode. Tell us what you think of it. Tell us some other maybe common events that you know were not true that are commonly understood to be true. Drop us a comment about those and we'll add them into our part two in the future. So let's go ahead and start out looking at the 25 events in history that never really happened. Number one, Martin Luther nailed his thesis to a church door. So as everyone knows who knows about Martin Luther, he was a Catholic monk who at the time in the Catholic Church, he believed there was a lot of corruption happening and he was disgusted by it. And he started putting a thesis together and started putting many different letters together to the Catholic Church and to the leaders within the church that he was reporting to. And the commonly understood aspect of history is that he took this thesis that he had generated over a number of years, showing his disgust for the Catholic Church and the need for reform. And he nailed the thesis to the church door so everyone in public could see it. And actually, that did not happen. The more likely story of what really happened was that Luther bombarded the Pope with letters and also church leadership with letters until he got them annoyed enough to act. In fact, Luther was not thrilled that the public had found out about his thesis at all. He wanted it to be kept a secret between himself, the Pope, and church leadership. Luther never intended or wanted to start his own church, the Lutheran Church. He just wanted the Pope to stop taking money for salvation. He wanted to stop the corrupt practices in his mind of salvation being bought and sold by church leaders. And so, as you can see, the commonly understood aspect of history that he nailed it to the church door actually did not occur. It's an interesting one there. Number two, so there was a rumor that after the stock market crash of 1929, 1930 that brought on the Great Depression, that stockbrokers were jumping out of windows all over Wall Street. And actually, that never did happen. Even though there was some suicides that did occur among stockbrokers, it happened over about a 5-year period. It was not something that was a major event that occurred right after the crash. There was a popular comedian at the time that made a quip about this event that spectators needed to stand in line to get a window to jump out of. So he was making a joke about this, and the newspapers all over the country picked that up and ran the headline that stockbrokers were committing suicide all over New York. The myth just grew and grew and grew from there. And even today, people still mention it, that there were stockbrokers that were committing suicide due to the stock market crash. And that just didn't happen on a mass basis. The bankrupt stockbroker leaping from a window became a stereotype that was never really a reality. In reality, what ended up happening, many of them ended up going into different professions. They ended up moving to different areas of the country, starting new lives. And some of them actually were able to rebuild their businesses over the course of 5 to 10 years. And so that was really more of a reality of what happened. So the stockbrokers jumping out of windows was just a myth, as said here. Number three, the ancient Romans were known for their orgies. And it's very commonly spoken about in our culture and in our history and in our movies and our TV shows, showing Romans laying around eating grapes and having sex with each other and doing all kinds of weird things in an orgy-like fashion. That was really the commonly known thing. And what's interesting, if you really dig into the history of Romans, they actually were doing just the opposite. that any sex that they did have, they had behind closed doors with their spouses. Typically, in some ways, they were doing it with as much clothing as possible on. So the reality of the history, if you really look at Roman behavior, they were not having orgies and they were not doing anything like what popular culture has shown them to do. What is interesting, though, the Romans did like to party and they did like to have a good time. Typically would have it in very big settings with music involved, court jesters and comedians, other performers. You'd have fire jugglers, and of course later in their empire, the gladiators were a big part of it. But in terms of the orgy myth that came out of popular culture, this simply just didn't happen. Number 4, the US freaked out when the Soviets beat us to space. And actually, that wasn't true. When Sputnik actually went into space, and you can see a picture there on the right of the first Sputnik satellite that went into space, and then you can see it on the launch pad down on the bottom right. And you can see the Apollo NASA rocket that actually went into space shortly after Sputnik. The reason the US government was actually relieved and did not freak out is thanks to German scientists. The US had space program locked and loaded for over a year before the Soviet Union launched its Sputnik program. The problem was political. President Eisenhower at the time was worried about national borders that extended into infinity and that space travel could constitute an invasion of another country's borders. There was actually a real concern that they may be actually violating international law and that may touch off a war. And so the US held off and held off, even though they had the capability to do so, until the Russians went first. And then eventually, after Soviet Union sent the Sputnik up, the United States felt like they were unshackled to go ahead and launch the NASA program. So unlike the commonly known history of this, that the US was very upset and freaked out, they actually were very relieved when the Soviets beat them into space. Number 5, during the Cold War, the president had a phone for calling Russia. This was not true. The red phone never really existed, as shown in movies and TV shows and other commonly shown items around this time. There just never was this phone between our president and the Russian president. Not that it wouldn't have been useful, but during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as an example, both countries relied on a patchwork of communication methods, ranging from a slow and not always accurate courier system to Russian radio channels over which messages sometimes took as long as a half day to reach their destination and be translated. So if you can just imagine how dangerous this situation was, the closest we've ever come to nuclear war with the Russians putting missiles into Cuba. The communication methods back and forth were not nearly as good as they should have been. And we got very lucky to avoid this potential war. You can see some great pictures there on the top right of Khrushchev and Castro meeting in Cuba. You can see the different maps, both on the bottom and the top, of what it looked like where the missiles were laid in Cuba and how close they were to the United States. And then you see all the different headlines that were coming out of the newspapers at that time, that Kennedy was very rough with the Russians, told them to lay off and to move their missiles out of the region or else we would have a serious problem. But very interesting that there was this perception that we had a phone call system back and forth between the two leaders, and nothing could be further from the truth. Number 6, in the Middle Ages, rats spread the Black Death. It was thought that the bubonic plague, as it wiped out 100 million people during the 14th century, the worst plague in human history, that it was spread attributed to fleas living on rats. So that was the commonly known and reported cause of death back then, was that the fleas living on rats were spreading it to humans. And that's what they went with, and that's what they've been writing about in all of history. But it turned out it was not the rats, actually. Scientists now studying in the last 50 years weather patterns determine that it could not have been rats. Europe experienced plague outbreaks after Central Asia had a wet spring followed by a warm summer. Terrible conditions for black rats, but ideal for gerbils. There's also evidence that it wasn't spread by fleas at all, but that it was airborne instead. And so they, in the last 50 years, have done a lot of studies on this and have determined that it was an airborne disease. It could not have been spread at all by rats or any type of small animal. and that it was, in fact, spread between humans back and forth via airborne disease. It's very interesting that this long assumed historical fact was actually not true. Number 7, remember Paul Revere's midnight ride. You see a great picture there of Paul Revere with his lantern riding into the countryside to go warn the colonists that the British were coming. He galloped through the colonies shouting, "British are coming, British are coming." However, the reality, if you really dig into the history of it, he was actually barely involved in this event. The version of Paul Revere's story that's taught in schools exists from a Longfellow poem, which was somewhat fictional. Revere was made the hero because his name rhymed with here. There were actually on that day more like 40 total riders, quietly warning colonists all over New England. And Paul Revere did not get very far because he was stopped at a pub where he was intercepted by sentries and surrendered to the English. So he literally only was part of this event for about an hour and then got captured and arrested. The other 39 riders, of course, made it to all their different destinations, all the small towns around New England. But Paul Revere was always the symbol of that event. So very interesting that he's given all the credit, but was largely not very involved. Number 8, the War of Worlds broadcast caused widespread panic. Its news broadcast format terrified listeners who didn't realize they were listening to a radio drama. People were actually excited in real life, and nobody panicked. The newspapers and magazines had a field day reporting alien-fueled panic, even staging photos of people preparing for a Martian invasion. But it never actually happened. Even those who joined the broadcast late weren't fooled that often. Worst case, they assumed that they were listening to reports of a Nazi invasion. And you can see some of the headlines that came down at that time. Radio fake scares nation, radio play terrifies nation. You see a picture there, a great picture of Orson Welles, who did the actual broadcast and was reading off the War of the Worlds, which was a fictional piece. So as you can see, this was very much a media scandal from the very beginning. It was pumped up by the media to make it interesting for readers. But in reality, when they went back and interviewed many, many people years later, they were not scared at all, and they found it very intriguing, interesting, entertaining. In some cases, thinking that maybe there was a Nazi invasion, but that was about the worst. Number 9, 16th century chastity belts were a nightmare. You can see a picture of some of the chastity belts there on the right. When a man left his wife or daughter alone for an extended period, he'd gird her with a padlocked iron underwear to make sure she stayed chaste. Except no, chastity belts weren't actually real. They didn't actually exist back then. They were made famous in satirical images, something like today's political cartoons that were meant as a joke. The chastity belts that appear in museums were constructed later on as gag gifts or as examples. It's very interesting that this whole concept of chastity belts that we've always assumed were true and always were used back in some of the ancient periods never really existed. They were always a figment of the imagination and really kind of a joke. Number 10, did Napoleon's army blast off the Sphinx's nose? You can see a picture there, a great old painting of Napoleon on his horse sitting in front of the Sphinx when Napoleon and his army actually conquered Egypt. You see another picture there on the bottom right of Napoleon and his troops taking on the local tribe that they were fighting. The fact is that the nose was already gone when Napoleon got there. So no, he did not take off the nose, as is sometimes reported. Reports dating back to the 1500s, a full 200 years before Napoleon reportedly took pot shots at the Egyptian statue with his pistol, confirmed that the Sphinx had no nose at the time he got there. In fact, one account claims that the nose was destroyed by Muhammad Saim al-Dir in 1378, well before Napoleon arrived. So very interesting how these stories get started and these rumors and these different myths, and they just become assumed that they're fact. And yet when you really look into them, you realize that he could not have knocked the nose off because it wasn't there when he got there. Number 11, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. And it's kind of common understanding, in fact, among historians that Nero was by far Rome's worst emperor of all for many, many reasons. As the story goes, Nero wanted more room to build his palace, so he set fire to a neighborhood and played the violin while he watched it burned. But he couldn't have. For one thing, fiddles didn't exist at the time. So the whole idea, as you see in the pictures there, of him fiddling during Rome burning couldn't have happened because the instrument didn't exist yet. Nero wasn't even in Rome when it burned either. And they said this source of this idea must have come from a very gossipy history book or maybe some type of article at the time by somebody who was not a fan of Nero's, to try to show that he didn't care about his people, didn't care about his city. So they used it as kind of a propaganda piece, and then it took hold as history, when in fact it actually did not happen. Number 12, Let Them Eat Cake by Marie Antoinette. Upon learning that the peasants had no bread to eat, Marie Antoinette never said that. The source of the quote is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it was written when she was about 11 years old and still an Austrian princess. She wasn't even queen yet of France. According to her biographer, it would have been out of character anyway for her. Marie Antoinette was a kind woman who donated lavishly to charity and really cared about the people. You see a picture there on the top right of Marie Antoinette, what she would have looked like. And unfortunately, she and her husband, Louis XIV, went to the guillotine during the French Revolution. So you can see a picture of what the guillotine would have looked like. And then there's a real nice painting of her that was actually occurred at the time when she was queen. So she did not say, let them eat cake. Number 13, Lady Godiva rode through town nude. And you can see a famous picture there on the top right that was painted by a painter about 100 years later after this event, showing Lady Godiva sitting nude on top of a horse riding through town. She took her naked horseback ride through town as through the town of Coventry as a protest for her husband's exorbitant taxes on their fellow townsmen. But there's no reason for her to have done that. Lady Godiva owned the town. She didn't need permission from her husband to lower taxes. The source of the story is a monk who wrote it 100 years after Lady Godiva's death, based on a rumor that can't be backed up. Historians think the tale might be a metaphor for her unbridled generosity. And you can see a couple pictures of what they think she probably really looked like when she rode around town on her horse, with clothing on, not clothing off. It's very interesting how these rumors and these myths get started. But she did not ride around nude, and she was actually very much for the people. Number 14, pre-Renaissance audiences loved a good jousting match. Actually, they preferred horseshoes. So jousting wasn't even really possible during the pre-Renaissance period. Jousting came in the Renaissance period, many centuries later, because jousting stirrups weren't adopted in most of Europe until the 11th century. Medieval leisure time was actually spent on activities like bowling or dancing or tag or the game of horseshoes. And you can see a picture of horseshoes being played there in the middle and on the lower part of the page, showing one of the more popular activities at that time. And of course, there's a joust that you would see in the top right during the Renaissance period, which would be several hundred years later. Number 15, have you heard that the Hoover Dam is full of corpses? There was a rumor that had it that several workers fell into the concrete during construction and died, and that there was corpses that have been solidified into the dam itself. And there's actually a plaque, and you can see it there in the middle of the page, and on the right, it's actually a plaque there that dedicates to the workers and to those who died at the site. However, there were no corpses that were actually in the dam when they really looked into the history of it. Yes, there were some men that died during construction because we were bad at workplace safety at that time. But only one man got hurt by falling into the wet cement, and he was immediately pulled right out of the cement. First off, concrete was set in small, shallow increments. And second, entombed bodies would wreck the structural integrity of the dam, and they wouldn't have allowed it. So interesting that this myth is pervaded even with the plaque on the site. They're still purveying this myth, but it actually is not true. There were no corpses in Hoover Dam. Number 16, the Civil War armies marched under the Confederate flag, and everyone considers the Confederate flag to be the one on the top right there, and it was the first one they had. However, during the 5-Year War, they had actually 5 different flags, 4 of which are shown here. Top one to the right was the first one. The second one was the one that looks a little bit like the Betsy Ross flag. Then they went to a white flag with the Confederate cross up in the left corner. And then they went to one that was similar to that, but with a little red edge on the right side. The first Confederate flag was the Stars and Bars flag and was replaced in 1863 because it looked too much like the Union Stars and Stripes. It was replaced by an all-white flag with a red box in the corner. It was the final one when the war ended. So very interesting that the Confederates went through so many different versions of their flag during a 5-year period. Number 17, Columbus is the discoverer of America. Actually, he landed closer to Haiti. Christopher Columbus actually discovered the Bahamas archipelago and then Hispaniola, land which is currently split between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He traveled further south in his later voyages to Central and South America, but he never got close to what is now called the United States. So there's a real perceived myth there that Christopher Columbus discovered America and that he was the one who found the United States today, but that is just not true. He found the Caribbean and South America were the places that he found during his voyages. You see some great pictures there of Columbus as he was coming aground in all these different places he discovered. And if you didn't get a chance to look at our episode on traveling through history on Christopher Columbus, we get into a lot of the details of his different discovery missions and what he did during each of those and what he discovered during each. So you definitely should check that out. Number 18, early Christians were fed to the lions in the Colosseum. And one of the earliest, most terrifying examples of Christian persecution and martyrdom and propaganda, as we now found out, because actually it never happened. Not a single illegitimate record exists of Romans executing any Christians in the Colosseum. It would have been impossible because at the time Nero was persecuting Christians, the Colosseum had not been built yet. By the time it was complete, Rome had gotten used to the idea of Christianity, and many of their prominent politicians and other leaders had already converted to Christianity. So this whole concept of Christians being fed to the lions of the Colosseum just did not occur, and was definitely a myth. Number 19, everyone in medieval times smelled awful. There's this concept that all of our history, except for recently, that humans were always smelling bad and did not bathe enough. In medieval times, that definitely was not true. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people actually liked to wash. They particularly enjoyed soaking in hot tubs. And as late as the mid-13th century, most towns and even villages had public bathhouses, not unlike Japanese do today. And you can see these were ancient paintings from all their different culture in the medieval times of showing people bathing, talking. It was kind of a ritual that they did on a regular basis. And in some ways, it was a social thing. You would go to a bathhouse, you would take a bath, you would talk, you would chat, you would laugh, you would socialize. And it was just a regular part of your schedule and part of your current routine. You can see a picture there on the bottom right of a fantastic bathhouse that still exists, and you can go visit today. Number 20, the Great Wall of China built by a single emperor. You can see some incredible photos there of one of the great achievements in human history, and that is the Great Wall of China that extends for thousands of miles across China. So while the Great Wall of China is a remarkable feat of engineering, it wasn't built by a single emperor, as is the rumor. It was constructed over several centuries, with various dynasties contributing to its expansion and fortification. As many as 11 different emperors were involved with building portions of it. So you can imagine how huge an achievement this would be for 11 emperors alone, but one emperor just did not happen. But still incredible that they were able to achieve this large wall across the entire country that took 11 different emperors to finish it off. Number 21, the myth of King Arthur, one of the most famous myths in our history, and most people assume that King Arthur actually existed. The legend of King Arthur, a legendary British king who is said to have ruled in the 5th or 6th century, is a popular subject of folklore and literature and was written about a lot. However, there's no archaeological or historical evidence to support his existence. Historians are largely split over whether he was a real person. and now lean more to the fact that he was a myth, since there was no physical or written evidence, unlike other kings in British history. So historians have looked at this for many centuries to try to figure out if King Arthur was real, and have now come largely to the conclusion he was not, that he was a mythical character, a mythical king that achieved all these different things that are written about in literature. So that's really interesting. And he appears in so many of our movies and so many of our TV shows and other cultural phenomenon. But that looks like King Arthur did not actually exist in real life. Number 22, the Trojan War. You can see a picture there of the Trojan horse being used to enter the city. The Trojan War was a conflict between Greeks and Trojans that is described in Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. It's a story that has captivated readers for centuries. While some scholars believe that the Trojan War may have been based on a real historical event, others argue that it was purely a literary creation or a fiction. There's little to no evidence of an actual Trojan War that lasted as long as it did in the fictional poem. So you can see some of those epic photos and pictures there. And most historians who really researched this for a long time have now concluded that the Trojan War actually did not happen. Maybe there were some skirmishes between the two, and there largely was during that time. Trojans and Greeks would have skirmished with each other many times, but in terms of a large war that went on for years, including a large siege, looks like it did not happen. There's no evidence that it did. Number 23, the Bermuda Triangle. Bermuda Triangle is a region in the Western Atlantic Ocean, and you can see it's there close to Bermuda, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Caribbean, and Florida. And it's known for its mysterious disappearances of ships and aircraft. While some believe that Bermuda Triangle is a cursed area, others suggest that the disappearances are due to natural phenomenon or human error. There's simply no evidence of any special circumstances that would make the area different from surrounding territories, other than it is a common area for major storms throughout the year. So you can see this is still a debate that's occurring today, and many people have studied it and gone and traveled all around the different edges of the triangle, trying to figure out if there's some magnetic force or something else. But there's never been any evidence by any scientist that there's anything special about this area, other than there have been a lot of accidents, and it looks like it's largely to human error trying to fly or sail into very large storms when they probably should have held off until the storms passed. Number 24, the Iron Maiden was not a medieval torture device. And you can see a picture of the Iron Maiden up on the top there in its current museum. And then you see a couple other renderings on the bottom there. One of them is a fictional rendering on the bottom left, and then on the bottom right is a engineer's rendering of what the Iron Maiden looks like, this purported torture device. Contrary to what many people believe, however, the Iron Maiden, a spiked coffin-like device, is not a real medieval torture tool. It was actually a creation in the 18th or 19th centuries, likely as part of Europe's fascination with medieval torture. There's no record of the Iron Maiden being used during the Middle Ages. It's more of a gruesome prop than a historical fact. Sometimes what we think of as a medieval history is just a later invention to support our preconceived notions about the era. So there is a lot of evidence that there was quite a bit of torture that did occur during the medieval times. It was a very brutal time to be alive, and a brutal time to be on the bad side of anybody who was in power. But there was no evidence that this particular device was used or anything like it. Number 25, George Washington did not chop down the cherry tree, as is in our common lore and that we've been taught at school. The story of young George Washington confessing to cutting down his father's cherry tree with the famous line, "I cannot tell a lie," is completely made up. It was first written by Parson Weems in a biography of Washington published largely after his death. Weems wanted to highlight Washington's honesty to the country, so he fabricated the story to make him seem more virtuous. Washington was undoubtedly a great leader, but the cherry tree incident is pure fiction and did not happen. So you can see many times has this story been told in American literature, in movies, in our common culture. in pictures demonstrating the actual event itself. And you can see the picture there of young George with his father. But again, this did not happen. It was a made-up lie to try to make Washington look more virtuous to the people. So hopefully you enjoyed that and learned a lot about the 25 events in history that never happened or didn't happen the way we've been taught, and that you enjoyed that, and that you learned to look into all history a little bit more, dig into it, research it, verify it, validate it. That's what we do here at Traveling Through History before we present it to you. And it does show that there's a pattern of common culture taking events in history and skewing them to make them more dramatic, to make them more interesting to the reader. However, that means that it does take it out of context and makes it actually not history, makes it fiction, and makes it something that is fabricated and not something we should pay attention to, or we should at least understand that it's fiction. So again, hopefully you enjoyed that, and that you'll try to do those types of practices in your historical research. Whenever you hear something, don't take one source, try to find multiple sources to back it up. We definitely do that for you here on the program. So please like this video, please subscribe to the channel. This was part 1 of this series, and we have more parts coming your way of some more events in history that actually did not happen. And we're going to really have a lot of fun bringing that to you. Hope you have a wonderful new year with your family, and enjoy your time off, and we'll see you in the new year on Traveling Through History. Hope you love history as much as we do. Have a good evening.